Hello and welcome. I am Joel from Joel Turner Designs, and today I'm going to be building a keepsake box for my cousin's second child. And what it is a little jewelry box type thing that they can put things from the hospital or little things that they need a place for the baby. And then once their child gets older, they can use the box as either a jewelry box or like a catch-all box or whatever they would like. So let's get right into it. Here, what I'm doing is just cherry picking what pieces of this board I want to use. This board was pretty roughly milled, it still has a lot of bark left on it, but there's still some really good pieces of wood in it, and I just need to get to them. So if you were going to be building one of these, and let's say you just went to the Home Depot and bought yourself some oak, or you had a lumber yard, it would probably be pretty much not in this kind of condition. So you would just get it and it would be done already. And it would be ready to pretty much chop down to your final size. The final size I decided to go with this is 14 by 6 by 5, I believe. And so that's what I'm doing right now. Is just milling these pieces up using my table saw to square everything up and get it chopped down to its final size. Okay, now that I've got everything chopped down to the size I want, I'm going to start cutting the actual box here. So what I did is I set the saw and chopped one piece at 14 inches and then used that piece as a template to cut the second piece. And you just line up the back end, then smack the saw blade into the top piece and then drop the saw and boom, done. Two pieces exactly the same size. Now I'm going to drop some 45s on the edges of these and make sure that they are the exact same size, because you want all these pieces to be the same size, otherwise your box is going to be out of square and it's going to be a giant hassle. So make sure your pieces are the same size. That's what I'm doing right here. I'm just lining them up and checking, and they are indeed. And now I'm using the leftover pieces to cut my width pieces, and those are 6 inches. So I'm just using that, cut a 45, use my speed square to transfer that mark over, drop the saw on it, and then use that piece to transcribe onto this one, and boom. Check them, make sure they're right, and they're right. Now I'm going to cut a rabbit with an E on the bottom of all these pieces, and what I'm doing is just running them through the table saw. Now if you had a dado set, you could set up and do this all in one pass, but I find that the time it takes to set the dado blade up is longer than it does to just do this and just run it through, run each piece through, tap the fence over a little bit, run them through again, and done. And then once that, just take a plane and clean up the inside of that rabbit to make it all look all nice and pretty. Okay, now that we've cleaned up that rabbit, we're going to do a tape up, glue up. And I immediately screwed up, so we fix that. And make sure your rabbits are all going the same direction. Take some tape and stick it on the back of each of your pieces. Line them up, press them down, and you'll see it starts to just kind of folds in on itself like this. And take some glue, run it through, get some good coverage on all of the pieces. Because you want, especially with me, with this board, it was kind of warped, so I want to make sure I got really good coverage here. And then fold it together. Take some pieces, secure it down, and then once it's secure, flip it over, make sure it's flush, and check it for square. And the way you check that for square is you go from corner to corner and check that and take that measurement, and then go from the opposite corner to corner, and if those measurements are the same, then your box is in square. Mine was a little bit out of square, so I'm going to use this clamp, this band clamp, to pull it back into square. And now that it's in the square, I am ready to go. So now just get a wet rag and cleaning up the squeeze out from inside those joints. It's just better to do it now than to try to scrape it out later. And a wet rag will just take care of that. Now, unfortunately my camera ran out of batteries. I didn't catch it, so you missed me cutting the bottom and gluing that in, and cutting these pieces down for the top, because I need to stick two pieces together. So what I'm doing now is I'm making some culls. I just took some old scrap wood I had laying around, and I'm taking packing tape and sticking it to the boards. And I'm going to sandwich these boards between them. I'm going to get some good glue coverage here, stick them in there, and then I'm going to clamp them down. And what that packing tape does is it doesn't let the glue that squeezes out from between this joint glue your clamp boards to your actual workpiece boards. It's a good little trick. And I knew that on the edge of these boards that I could take up whatever little bit of warp or anything I had like that. I could do that with a clamp, but those inside boards I need the culls for. So I'm just clamping it up and getting it set and ready to go, and just checking it and seeing that it's a little bit out there, and putting another really big heavy clamp on it to push those together. Alright, so now what I'm doing is I've set up my table saw sled here and put a stop block in. I'm cutting a piece of walnut into, that is exactly the width of my saw blade. That's the kerf of your blade. So if anybody ever hear anybody talk about kerf, that's the width of a saw blade. So I'm cutting 8 of these little pieces, and I'm going to do a little decorative trim piece on the corners of all these boxes, and I'm going to need those strips for it. And right now I'm setting up my jig that I made to do this. And basically what it is, this is it's 4 pieces at 45-degree angles, and I screw them down to my little table saw sled here. And then that just holds the box, or anything I want to do this kind of trim work with, just holds it at a 45-degree angle and secures it, so you can get a repetitive cut each time. And then with another stop block securing it to hold it in place, you just run it through, spin the box, run it through, spin the box, run it through, spin the box, then flip it around, and then do it all over again. And you just got to make sure that the depth on your saw blade isn't going all the way through your box. And you end up with these little cuts like this. And now I'm taking those walnut strips and sticking some glue in there, hammering them in with a piece of wood I had laying around, getting a lot of run out, but it's okay. Let's clean it up, and then we're gonna, once this glue dries, we're going to saw it off and sand it off. So any run out, we can just take care of that. And there's a little bit of a structural element to these, but the majority of it is decorative. Anytime you're adding surface area and then adding wood and glue to that, you're going to get a structural improvement. But for the majority, it's a decorative element. Usually this is done with like more of a contrasting wood, but I figured the cherry's going to get darker and the walnut's going to get darker, so it might look good. Only time will tell. Okay, it's about an hour later, and we're going to cut these little decorative pieces off with my Japanese saw. Japanese saw is cool for doing stuff like this, for doing small little light work. It works differently than a normal saw. A normal saw, like a ridgeback saw or something like that, they cut on the push. A Japanese saw, the teeth are backwards, so it cuts on the pull. So you get a lot of control that way, and it works out really well. I'm really happy with mine. I think I picked mine up at Harbor Freight for like $8, or even cheaper than that. It's a good little tool to have. But yeah, so we're just gonna hack these off, get them flush, and then we'll come back with a sander and take care of that in a little bit. Now we're taking the top out of the clamps, and you'll see how easy the culls come apart because of that packing tape. It's a really good trick, and you can see right there's a lot of squeeze out that happened between there and came right apart. So now I'm just going to take my orbital with some 80 grit on it and just clean up any bit of that glue that was left, or any where I didn't quite get it perfect, lined up, because that board was pretty warped. So just going to clean that up, and then we're going to glue the top onto the box. And I'm just checking it to make sure it's good. Getting really good coverage with my glue here because I want to make sure this thing is on there like crazy. I'm offsetting it so that there's some overhang on either side, and then I'm just going to clamp the heck out of it. Alright, we're about 2 hours later now. We're pulling the box out of the clamps and just checking it, make sure it's all good. And off to the router table. And I'm pulling out the roundover bit that was in there, and I'm going to stick a flush trim bit in. And a flush trim bit is it's a long cutting bit that has a bearing along the top of it, and what it does is that bearing rides along the sides of the box and does what its name implies. It trims whatever it is flush to that point. So that's why we had an overhang on the top of the box, is so we could trim it flush. Now we know the size of the box. We know the box is 6 inches wide, we know it's 14 inches long. We could set the table saw that way, but it could have been a little bit out of square. This 100% makes sure that top is flush to this box. So now we're just going to take the orbital again and clean up anything we might have missed earlier, and clean up those decorative trim pieces too. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to make a registration mark in the center of the box. We want to do this first before we put a roundover on it, because the roundover could skew the measurements a little bit. So we know the box is 6 wide, 14 long, so 3 down, 7 over, boom, that's the center of the box. We're going to use that mark to install the nameplate on it in a little bit. So I've put the 1/4 inch roundover back in the table here, and we're just going to route the top of the box. Sadly though, I do get some chip out on the last corner, and that could have been prevented by clamping 2 scrap pieces to either side of the box, and then that way the bit digs into the scrap instead of what happened right there. That was my bad. Now we're going to cut the top of the box off. So just set your table saw fence to whatever thickness you want the top to be. I like to try to make them kind of thick, because after I've cut some off in the past, they have warped. So just use your good judgment. And I like to cut the short sides first. That way when the box top does come apart, you're on a width side. It's a little bit more stable, and it's easier to control it that way. Then we're just going to take the orbital and clean up any rough edges we might have. Make sure it all fits nice and dandy. Then have a completely staged shot looking for hinges. Now we're going to mount the hinges. To do this, I like to make sure everything's all lined up first, then take a couple clamps, clamp the top of the box. This way it doesn't shift on you when it's moving around. Then I'm going to take my speed square, I'm going to measure 2 inches over from either side, make a little mark. Then I'm going to take the edge of my hinge and put it on that mark. That way I know they're both in the same spot. So if somebody does see the look behind the box, it's going to look right. It's in proportion. Then I take the speed square, line it up on the side, line it up with the edge of the hinge. That way I know the hinge is perpendicular to that side of the box. Do it for both sides. Then take some painter's tape and tape down one side of the hinge. That way it stays in place when you're doing the pilot holes here. Otherwise, you're trying to hold it with your thumb and you're trying to line up the drill bit, and it could shift on you, and you don't want it to shift. If your hinge shifts, you could get like binding on the thing. It could open up. A whole lot of bad things can happen. So making sure your hinges are square and they don't move on you is really important. I'm just taking my finish sander here with 120 in it, and I'm going over the whole box. I'm making sure to get rid of any burn that the router bit might have left on it, and I'm just giving the whole box a once over, just get it nice and smooth for finishing here. Then I'm going to take some 2-part epoxy here, mix it up with a nail, stick it on the back of the nameplate, and plop it down right there in the center of that registration mark we made earlier. This stuff takes a good amount of time to set up completely, but it will be good enough to work with in about an hour. And then that way, if anything's terribly gone wrong, like you happen to mount the nameplate upside down, that might have happened to me at one point, you could still salvage the nameplate and scrape off that glue before it cures completely. So what I did was I just took a piece of cardboard, then a heavy piece of oak I had laying around, laid it on top of it, just secure it down and make sure it didn't move anywhere. Now I'm taking my X-Acto blade and I'm cleaning up any spill out or any push out that happened from that epoxy. It's still malleable enough that I can scrape it off here with just the X-Acto blade. Once it cleared off all the excess that's squeezed out, just take a piece of painter's tape, stick it over the nameplate, and then trace around it with the X-Acto blade. We're going to be doing the finishing here, and I want to make sure that that nameplate's protected so there's no reaction between the metal and the finish. Plus, we're going to be doing some sanding as well, so if the edge of that sandpaper catches that plate, it's going to scratch it, and then it's going to look like crap. And then by then, it's secured on there. So just cover it up, make sure it's good. For finishing, I'm using a spray shellac. I like spray shellac as opposed to like a spray polyurethane because one, it doesn't smell as terrible as polyurethane does. It sets up faster, and it just dries way faster. Like 20 minutes, you can give it a sand, give it another coat. And that's pretty much what we're going to see happening here. Is it's going to be spray, sand, spray, sand, spray, sand, and you just want to keep repeating that process. With me, this piece of wood, this wood I had was really soaking this stuff up, so I didn't have to sand it till about the 4th or 5th coat. So here we are on about the 4th or 5th coat. I got 1,000 grit sandpaper out. I'm just going to go over it, knock down any high points, any dust that might have got in there since we're doing this indoors and it's my workroom and it's dusty as hell. And just doing this, like any runs that happen, because that can happen with spray. You get a run and you won't see it, but you'll see it when you sand it. You'll see it pop out. Just give it a good sand, give it a good once over, and it's going to get this like white sheen to it, and you see it just disappears right away. And you just want to keep repeating this process until you get a nice, good, thick coat on there. So we're about 7 or 8 coats in by this point, and it's time to pull off the masking tape. There was a little bit of residue left over on the nameplate, and I think a little bit of the shellac got in underneath it, but it wasn't a big deal. A little spit and polish pulled it right off, scraped it off my fingernail. Looks fine. I was very happy with the results. Sadly, though, in the video, it was still a little wet, and I did put a big old handprint on the middle of the shellac, but I just sanded that off and waited for it to dry, sanded it, gave it another coat, and you see I post some pictures here at the end of the video of it completely done, and you can see that's gone. So I hope you enjoyed my video, and I hope you learned something, and I hope you try to make one yourself. And if you have any questions, comments, screams, or yells, just go ahead and throw them down in there in the comments, and I hope you enjoyed.